through an effort to pass a new type of Voting Rights Act that could do as much as eliminate registration requirements and make it so that everyone is automatically registered to vote anytime you interface with the government, so you wouldn't have to register. And that harkens back to what I was talking about earlier, how registration laws came out of the 1890s movement to limit access to the vote. They're the one piece of law that's come out of that movement that hasn't really been recognized as a barrier. And this would be a federal recognition of that and elimination of really the registration requirement by basically anytime someone pays their taxes or interfaces with the government, they become registered. So that's kind of what's going on at the federal level. Now the state level was fascinating because, again, states often have this stronger responsibility to administer elections, and particularly the time, place, and manner of elections. And the biggest movement on the state level right now legislatively has been around access to casting a ballot. And by that I mean making it so you can vote on a Saturday, a Sunday, you could vote early, or that you could vote by mail, or that you can, if you show up to vote on election day and you're not registered, you can simply register on election day right there. It's called election day registration. The biggest movements right now on the state level are to pass those types of pieces of legislation. And unfortunately, Michigan, though we used to be at the forefront of passing these types of laws to promote access, we have not seen any movement on any of those pieces of legislation. Vote by mail, no reason absentee, early voting or same day or election day voter registration in our legislature for a number of years. And we can go more into that in the Q&A if we want to talk about why that is. And I'm happy to, as someone who's been involved in trying to get those laws passed, I'm happy to share some anecdotes. But to just sort of get back to the administrative level, that's sort of the third piece of this. And what's happening on the administrative level in several different states is this recognition that I was talking about before, this increased recognition that these statewide election administrators, the secretaries of state or the boards of elections in other states that don't have secretaries of state, that they actually play an increasingly recognizable role in the political process and the elections process, and it's one that voters are starting to become more engaged in. So Deborah Bowen, Secretary of State in California, recognized that some of these electronic voting machines that Ken Blackwell used in Ohio and others have used in other states could be tampered with. So she, with the swipe of her pen, decertified all electronic voting machines in her state until they could be proved that they passed certain security requirements. And she got a lot of awards for that. And Jennifer Brunner, the new Ohio Secretary of State, did the same thing. And so, similarly, Mark Ritchie in Minnesota, recently now, I think it was last week it finished, but oversaw the Franken-Coleman recount in a state where, over a seat, really, that was held by Paul Wellstone, who was a hero of mine and to many of us, I think, but a really crucial seat. And you saw for this national exposure, he worked to oversee the recount in a very fair and impartial way. And so we see this across, I think, in terms of trends right now, this increased recognition of how that Secretary of State's position or the Board of Elections in certain other states like New York that doesn't have a Secretary of State that runs elections. We've seen increased recognition of how much responsibility and impact those individuals or boards can have in promoting access to the vote or limiting it in the case of Harris and Blackwell. And so, I guess to get back to the question I started with about, where are the voting rights battles of today? In my view, it's at the federal, state, legislative, and administrative level, and it's just, I think, incumbent upon all of us to recognize that, become familiar with that, and then concurrently recognize that these are issues that, because they really only come up when an election is close and there's a recount, or on November 3rd or 4th or 2nd, or whenever election day is and around there, it's incumbent upon those of us who care about access and care about civil rights and voting and access to the vote to make sure the light is shined on these issues all year long, 365 days a year, because they really only gather or capture many people's attention at a time that's close to a close election. But in reality, they're decisions that are made on all three of those levels that I talked about daily and debated repeatedly just last week at the Supreme Court that do have an impact on who votes on those crucial election days. So I would just say, in my view, I think we need to start and continue to pay more of attention to the voting rights battles on all those levels and be more engaged because it's easy to not work on them on the 11 months of the year when we're not talking about elections. But at the same time, those decisions that are made in those 11 months of the year have a strong impact on who wins those elections and who votes in those elections in November or August or other parts of the year. So, and the last thing I'll say, I'll just close and then we can start the discussion, is that we, I think generally we all have a lot more power than we realize. And I think a lot of times we feel that we don't have direct access to the political process or those decisions that are being made on the national level or on the state level. But to me, the power of the vote is the strongest, is one of the most significant pieces of power that any of us have. And I know many of you know this because many of you are organizers and many of you work on mobilizing voters in other areas. And I think, to me, we often lose sight of how powerful that vote can be because we are rightfully so focused on issues and other issues like education and criminal justice issues and healthcare. But the reason why the Voting Rights Act, in my view, was the culmination of the civil rights movement is because, and the reason why the vote is a fundamental right is because it really is the most powerful tool we have at affecting change and the most direct access we have to affecting change. And it's incumbent upon all of us to protect that access for everyone because it is really the root of so much power among our citizens. So thank you, and we can start taking questions. Yes?
I'm going to exercise control over the microphone just once. So I have one question before I recognize you, and then you, Dan, did you have your hand up? Okay, you, and then Rosalie, and so forth. I was interested in voter turnout as a measure of access, and whether there's empirical data on whether as the means of opening up access to the polls through easier registration and other means, that has an effect on voter turnout.
Yeah, that's a great question because the only reform that has been statistically shown, and this is, I'm talking about 10% difference, to increase voter turnout is same-day voter registration, allowing people to register to vote on election day. All of the other reforms, vote by mail, those things, they can increase turnout, but Michigan is 7th in the country for voter turnout. And every state above us, with the exception of Oregon, has same-day voter registration. And Oregon doesn't have same-day voter registration, but they have vote by mail. And so in my view, the thing that's keeping us from being number one is that we don't allow citizens to register to vote on election day if they show up and they're not registered. And it's a simple reform that it's frustrating that we don't have it, but I think if we did, it would be number one.
You said at the beginning of your talk that we elect the representatives who then delegate the power of how the process works. But the problem is I've observed, and I didn't grow up in this country, but from what I've seen is you need an awful lot of money to run a campaign and be elected. So you really, I feel at the outset, are disenfranchising the majority of the country because it's a select group of people who support each other and put each other in these positions, these powerful decision-making positions. So right out the gate, I see a problem, and I agree with everything you say. But what could be done do you think, to address that? And then while I have the microphone, could you just elaborate a little bit on all the shenanigans of the Coleman, Franken election, like why it took so long, what were